It is my great honor to use the Stanley Plotkin gavel to open this meeting.
It's our good friend and colleague, Dr. Stan Plotkin.
Dr. Plotkin.
Virtually every country in the world is affected by his vaccines.
He was involved in pivotal trials on anthrax, oral polio, rabies vaccine,
Rubella vaccine, the rotavirus vaccine, rabies.
He has earned the Distinguished Physician Award of the Pediatric Infectious Disease Society, the Finland Award of the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases, the Hilleman Award of the American Society for Microbiology, the French Legion of Honor, and the Bruce Medal in Preventive Medicine.
He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and the French Academy of Medicine.
One of the very special things about him is the global impact that he's had, not just from the products, but from his book.
He developed the standard textbook for vaccines in 1988.
Bill Gates calls his book a Bible for vaccinologists.
I hope you all have indeed have read the book, and I hope it's more accurate than the Bible.
He trained just a generation of scientists, including myself, to think like he thinks.
Counsel, please introduce yourselves for the record.
Aaron Siri, co-counsel on behalf of plaintiff. Good morning. Can you please state your full name for the record?
Stanley A. Plotkin.
Dr. Plotkin, has there ever been a study which looked at the total health outcomes of children following the CDC's vaccination schedule and those who are completely unvaccinated?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think so.
Why has that study not been done?
Probably because it is considered bad malpractice not to vaccinate a child.
So you're saying a prospective study might be improper because it will leave a child unvaccinated?
Correct.
Okay. What about a retrospective study?
That, I suppose, could be done, but it wouldn't be randomized.
Can you define retrospective, please?
I mean, looking at children who had been vaccinated and comparing them to children who had not been vaccinated.
Okay. Presumably HMOs, insurance companies would have health data on enough vaccinated and unvaccinated children to conduct such a comparison, correct?
Well, I don't know, because the percentage of unvaccinated children, fortunately, is quite low. So I'm not sure how easy it would be to do that study. And I would suspect that many of those unvaccinated children are not in registers that could be used.
You're familiar with the Vaccine Safety Data Link?
Yes.
Are you aware that there are a few thousand children that are completely unvaccinated in the VSD?
Oh, I don't doubt it.
Okay. Couldn't the Vaccine Safety Data Link be used to conduct a retrospective vaccinated versus unvaccinated study to look for health outcomes?
Well, I don't know. Theoretically, perhaps, but one would have to be convinced that the children were comparable in other ways besides being vaccinated or unvaccinated.
Okay. Every time you do a retrospective study, that you always need to control for potential confounders, correct?
Correct.
And that's what you're talking about, controlling for confounders, right?
Yes.
So I mean, the CDC, pharma, they conduct studies all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Including studies.
Yes.
Yes, including studies that have confounders that need to be controlled for, right?
Yes. They
Vaccines.
try, yes.
Vaccine studies, especially for efficacy, happen all the time, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, again, if the data is there, why not do a study comparing vaccinated to completely unvaccinated children to look for the total health outcomes so you know what the real risks are from vaccine, or get at least a sense of what the real risks are for from vaccinations?
Well, I can't completely answer that question. I'm sure it would be a difficult study to do.
So you just think it's too difficult to look at, to do a study comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated children, even though the data exists to do that. Is that right?
Well, I simply am saying that I don't know how feasible it is. I've never been asked to look at it before, but I do think a priori that it would be difficult because those children are very likely from different socioeconomic groups and different racial groups, and so it will be a difficult study to do. I don't know if it's feasible or not.
So with all of the government, so the pharmaceutical industry, you said, made approximately $20 billion last year in revenue from vaccine sales?
I think so. I don't.
I have the financial statements. Mm-hmm. Should we review them, or do you think $20 billion is about right?
I think it's about right. I'm not an accountant. I don't
give or take
read those.
Give or take $1 billion or $2 billion, would you say?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yes.
So the pharmaceutical industry has had $20 billion in revenue, and the CDC spends hundreds of millions of dollars buying vaccines every year. Is that right?
I think so.
Okay. But yet you don't think that the resources can be done to do a single, solitary study comparing the health outcomes of a for-profit product given to almost every child in this country to assess what the rate of adverse reactions are between those who get all those products and those who don't?
What I said is I simply don't know whether such a study is feasible or not, but I think it would be difficult to do because it would not be a randomized study, and therefore the conclusions might be questionable. But I don't know whether such a study is feasible or not.
Aren't most studies that are done that you rely upon in that book that you have in front of you not randomized?
Many of them are not. Many of them are.
Dr. Plotkin, I'm going to hand you what's being marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 23.
Whoops, I'm sorry.
Dr. Plotkin, what's an ICD-9 code?
Well, it's essentially a way of coding diseases usually for remuneration purposes.
Okay. So when a doctor administers a drug or diagnoses as a patient or something similar, there's a code that they would enter into the system, right?
Yes.
And the ICD-9 codes are published by the American Medical Association, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Please take a look at the exhibit I just handed you is the 2015 ICD-9 CM Professional Edition for Physicians Codebook, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Or at least the front page and one excerpt, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So if you go to the second page, do you see there's a code V64.07?
Yes.
What is that code for?
Vaccination not carried out for religious reasons.
Okay. So wouldn't it be feasible, for example, to compare children who have this coding, who are not being vaccinated, with those who are being vaccinated, who are in similar communities, have similar demographics, and otherwise avoid as much as possible other potential co-founders?
Well, if you could eliminate the co-founders, it would be feasible.
And what are the co-founders, Dr. Plotkin?
Well, as I said before, the co-founders include a socioeconomic level, racial grouping, exposure to agents. In other words, are they living in a community where it's unlikely that someone unvaccinated from Ethiopia is going to come into the community and be able to transmit diseases? I'd have to sit down and write up a list of possible co-founders, but there would be many of them.
So when you do studies for efficacy, are you able to control for all of these co-founders?
Well, usually the effort is to include as many different types of individuals as possible, so that if there is a problem with a particular group, you can identify it. But doing clinical studies is not always easy, and that's why the conclusions from clinical studies have to be seen in relation to other clinical studies.
Why is it you can control for co-founders in various other vaccine studies, including in vaccine safety studies that are cited in your book, but you believe are you saying you couldn't control for these same co-founders in the study of a vaccinated versus unvaccinated population?
I am unable to draw a conclusion about whether such a study is feasible. What I'm pointing out is that the likelihood of there being multiple co-founders confounders, is very high, and therefore it wouldn't be an easy study to do. That's all I can say. I've never sat down to try to figure out how to do such a study.
Okay, well, we've got socioeconomic, which are probably pretty easy to control for, racial grouping, pretty easy to control for, exposure to agents. Since it's retrospective, you'll know if there's been an outbreak in a community. What other co-founders do you think might exist? I mean, I'd like to hear one that can you tell me a co-founder that's not easy to control for?
In principle, one can control for any confounding problem. The issue would be just how many there are and just how large a group you would need for statistical significance. See, that's another issue. I mean, we accept as a valid conclusion something that is false 5 times out of 100. And so not only do we have to try to eliminate confounders, but we also need repetition of studies to be sure that the results we got in the first study were not in the 5 studies that were false in their conclusion.
But
so you would need multiple studies.
Okay. And since these are retrospective, they're really just running data, right?
If the data are encoded, yes.
Okay. So I asked earlier, what co-founder can you list that's not easy to control for? And I did not hear another co-founder. Can you tell me a co-founder in this proposed study that would not be easy to control for?
Exposure would be probably the most difficult. In other words, whether a child is living in a community where exposure to disease is rare or absent, or a child is living in a community where there are significant possibilities of exposure. I think that would be probably the most difficult to account for.
When's the last case of polio in the United States, wild polio?
Oh, I forget the exact year, but it's been probably 20, 25 years.
Would 1979 sound correct to you?
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. So that wouldn't be an issue, correct?
No, polio would not be an issue.
Okay. How many cases of diphtheria have there been in the last 10 years in the United States?
It's very rare or absent.
All right. Less than 5, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Isn't that true for most of the diseases, except for maybe pertussis, right?
Well, pertussis, HIV, hepatitis, those are diseases that are still common.
Okay, so if we excluded
Mumps. Yeah.
Go ahead. Mumps, pertussis. Okay. So, since this is retrospective, we would know where those outbreaks are, right? Because they're very carefully tracked by the CDC, correct? Since we know where the outbreaks are for those diseases, that could be, was that a yes?
Yes.
Since we know where those outbreaks are, that could be actually probably pretty easily controlled for as well, correct?
In principle, yes.
Okay, so can you name me a co-founder that would be difficult to control for in the study?
Well, at the moment, I can't think of any other that would be material, although I think one would have to look at genetic issues and the health of other members in the family and so forth. But again, I am not saying that such a study is impossible. I'm just pointing out that it would be a very difficult study to do, and the conclusions that you could draw from the study might be very limited.
Well, when you keep saying it's difficult, but and your reason for that, I understand, is potential co-founders, and I'm just trying to understand what those are. So, you've said familial history. Presumably, the parents would be in the same health plan as the children, so you'd have the parents' medical history too, correct? So that could be controlled for as well, right?
Yes.
And you said 2 questions ago? That was a yes? Okay. So that could be easily controlled for, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so can you tell me again, can you tell me a co-founder that would actually be difficult to control for in this study?
Well, other than the ones that I've mentioned, and not having thought about doing such a study, that's all I can say.
Okay. Are you aware that advocacy groups and other people interested in this issue have been calling for this exact study of comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated for 30 years already?
I don't spend a lot of time on the web, so I can't say that I know that such a study is being requested.
Okay. Well, but you do read IOM reports and CDC reports. Okay. And you never come across any IOM or CDC reports in which they specifically address the repeated calls for such a study?
No.
Okay. Would it be surprising to you if I told you those existed?
That what existed?
That CDC and IOM reports in which they document the calls for such a study.
No, I wouldn't be surprised, no.
Would you be surprised to know that the CDC, in fact, issued an entire report regarding conducting such a study and the calls for conducting such a study?
And they issued the what, did you say?
I said, would you be surprised to know that the CDC, in fact, issued a report in response to the request for the calls for such a study?
No, I wouldn't be surprised that there was a response, no.
Okay. So, in looking for such a study, isn't it true that there actually has been one such study conducted in the past, for the first time ever, in the last year? Correct?
I'm not aware of that study.
Okay. I'm going to hand you what's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 24. The title of this study is a pilot comparative study of the health of vaccinated and unvaccinated 6 to 12-year-old United States children, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the authors of this study are professors at the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, School of Public Health, Jackson State University, correct?
That's what it says.
Are you familiar with this pilot study, Dr. Plotkin?
No.
Okay.
I see it's been published in the Journal of Translational Science, which is not one of the journals I read, and is probably one of those multiple so-called predatory journals that we are trying to deal with currently.
So is anybody in any university that publishes anything that's negative about vaccines predatory, or I forgot the other adjectives you used earlier today?
It's not that. Is that there are journals now that will publish anything for money. And I get about 10 of those invitations a day.
So does money influence judgment?
It may.
Conduct? Yeah.
It may. I cannot tell until I read this study.
I understand. So, well, in this study, if you look, if you take a quick look at it, you'll see that it involves looking at total health outcomes between vaccinated and unvaccinated homeschool children.
Yes.
Okay. When you're ready, please turn to page 5. Okay. Now, do you see the row that says chickenpox?
Yes.
Okay, so the odds ratio for the unvaccinated were twice as likely. No, I'm sorry, 4 times as likely to get chickenpox, right?
Yes.
Yeah, 0.26, so odds ratio about 4. The kids who were unvaccinated were about 4 times more likely to get chickenpox. Okay, is that a yes?
Yes.
And do you see for whooping cough, the unvaccinated children were 3 times as likely to get whooping cough?
Yes.
Yes. Go down to where it says allergic rhinitis. What is that?
Well, it's essentially runny nose because of allergy.
Okay. Do you see that it says that the vaccinated children were 30 times as likely to have allergic rhinitis?
Yes, I see that number.
Do you see that it says that vaccinated children were 3.9 times as likely to have allergies?
Yes.
4.2 times as likely to have ADHD?
Yes.
4.2 times as likely to have autism spectrum disorder?
Yes.
2.9 times as likely to have eczema? 5.2 times as 5.2 times as likely to have learning disability?
Yes.
3.7 times as likely to have neurodevelopment disorder?
Yes.
And 2.4 times as likely to have any chronic condition?
Yes.
Okay. Wouldn't you like to see a larger scale study that refuted these claims?
It would be ideal, yes.
I'm going to show you one more study that was done with the same data from this author. Dr. Plotkin, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 25. Has it been sent? Okay. This is another study by this is another publication using the same data, I believe, from the same group of professors at the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, School of Public Health, Jackson State University, correct?
It appears that way, yes.
Yeah. Okay, and the title of this one is Preterm Birth, Vaccination, and Neurodevelopmental Disorders, a cross-sectional study of 6 to 12-year-old vaccinated and unvaccinated children, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'll give you a moment to read the abstract. Just Have you ever seen this study before?
No.
Okay, so just take a moment, please, and read the abstract.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So, Dr. Plotkin, could you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down in the abstract, you see where it starts, no association?
Yes.
Can you read that sentence and the next one?
No association was found between preterm birth and NDD in the absence of vaccination, but vaccination was significantly associated with NDD in children born at term, odds ratio 2.7. Is that sufficient?
And the next sentence, please, sir. Thank you.
However, vaccination coupled with preterm birth was associated with increasing odds of NDD, ranging from 5.4 compared to vaccinated but non-preterm children to 14.5 compared to children who were neither preterm nor vaccinated.
Okay. What does NDD stand for?
Neurodevelopmental disorders.
Right. And in this study, it was defined as learning disability, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and autism spectrum disorder, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
But I will also point out that
Yes.
the abstract says that it was a convenience sample of 666 children. So clearly it was in no way a randomized study.
Shouldn't we do better studies?
One would have to do a better study if
Larger samples?
larger samples and enrollment, not by convenience.
Right. I believe Dr. Mawson calls these pilot studies, correct? Because nobody else is doing them, so he tried with limited resources, not the resources of pharmaceutical companies and the CDC, to conduct such a study, right?
Well, that's your interpretation. I would have to read the study.
Fair enough. More than fair. Is it possible that his findings in both of these studies could be correct?
Is it possible? Yes, of course. Possibility is always possible.
And hopefully, and ideally, you would conduct a larger or at least additional similar studies to either confirm or dispute the findings in these studies, correct?
Ideally, yes.
Okay. Now, let me ask you a question. In terms of randomization, if, to make sure I understand the concept, if I, for example, choose to vaccinate based solely on birth dates, would that be randomized?
Yes.
Okay. And that would be considered a randomized study?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to hand you what's been marked, what is being marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 24. 26. Thank you. Sorry. This is the Peter Abe study that you and I were talking about earlier, correct?
This is one of them.
Right. This is the study in which Peter Abe found that children who received DPT in the first 6 months of life versus those who got no vaccines died at 10 times the rate, correct?
Right.